Leuk dat je weer luistert naar een nieuwe aflevering van de Kinderopvang Podcast. Spelen is een serieuze zaak en essentieel voor de ontwikkeling van het jonge kind. Maar waarom is het zo belangrijk? En geven we onze kinderen wel genoeg speelruimte? In deze speciale reeks gaan directeur Emmeline en voorzitter Bas van het Woud elke aflevering in gesprek met een expert, onderzoeker of wetenschapper over het belang van spelen.
Beste mensen, welkom bij weer een podcast in het kader van het belang van spelen. En vandaag wel een hele bijzondere. In eerste instantie omdat we een hele bijzondere gast hebben, professor Peter Gray. Hij is wereldwijd autoriteit op het gebied van spelen. Professor, onderzoeker, schrijver van een belangrijk boek, Free to Learn. Hij heeft een mooie TED-talk gemaakt al 10 jaar geleden, die wij u van harte kunnen aanraden. Het betekent ook dat wij deze podcast, ik, Bas van het Woud en Emmeline, Bijlsma in het Engels moeten doen. Daar gaan we ons best voor doen. Maar de spreker is zo interessant dat dat vast goed moet komen. Dus veel luisterplezier weer bij deze podcast aflevering. Peter, you said I can call you Peter, but you're a very respected professor, so I'll try to keep it to Peter. Welcome and thank you very much for being here. We're really honored to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, well, great. We're doing a whole podcast series on the importance of play in our organization. And you're obviously an authority on that. You've wrote a book. You had a great TED Talk, which has been viewed almost 1 million times, I saw. So that's great. What, in essence, for you, is the importance of play for young children?
Well, play is really how children are biologically designed to learn, how they're biologically designed to develop. Play is, I might start by saying a little bit about what play is. Play is activity that is initiated and directed by the players themselves. So play is how children learn to initiate and direct activities. It's how they learn to take charge of life. It's how it's also how they interact with other children. A friend for young children is somebody you play with. So play is how children make friends. It's how they learn to get along with one another. Play is also, Mother Nature, which is my term for natural selection. I'm an evolutionary psychologist. Design children to play in ways that promote the kinds of skills that human beings everywhere have to learn. Children play at building things, they play at language, they play at imagination, which underlies hypothetical reasoning. They want, no matter how else they're playing, they want to play socially, and playing socially, they're learning how to negotiate and get along with other people. They're learning how to follow rules in play. They're learning an absolutely enormous amount, and there's no substitute. There's no other way to promote such learning other than play. We can't. Kids are not going to learn how to get along with one another by lecturing them on how to do it. They have to practice, and play is that practice. Basically, the way I think about learning is that, there's 2 aspects to what we call education. One is the acquisition of information, of knowledge, and the other is the acquisition of skills. And so the point I make in my book, Free to Learn, and elsewhere, is that children come into the world with 2 very, very strong drives to educate themselves. One is what we call curiosity. They want to explore the world. They want to know. They want to understand things. You can't stop them from exploring the world. That's why we have to baby-proof our house. They want to get into everything. And unless we kill that in school, unless we quash it by telling them that your questions aren't important, they continue being curious. We're all curious unless this gets quashed by people saying that your interests don't count. And the other part of education is the acquisition of skills, and play serves the purpose of the acquisition of skills. Play is doing things. And the children, when they're doing things in play, they're acquiring a whole repertoire of skills that are extraordinarily important for their development.
Yeah. I was talking
Yeah.
to my kids just before recording this podcast, and I said I'm going to talk to a professor who says less school and more play, and they completely agreed.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. If they didn't agree, I'd have
That
no
we-
chance.
They were just coming home from school, so they completely agreed. But I remember from your book and your TED Talk that you even were saying children are worse off than I was during the 1950s as a kid. Could you explain that a little bit to us?
So my data come primarily from the United States, but it's true perhaps to a somewhat lesser extent in Europe. There's one obvious way that children are much worse off in the United States, and that is the rates of anxiety, depression, suicide among teenagers are about 5 times now what they were in the 1950s. Even by standardized questionnaires to assess depression and anxiety, researchers have found that if you look at what the cutoff point would be for suspected major depressive disorder, in the 1950s, the rate of that disorder among school-age kids would be about 1/5 of what it is today. So we are stressing kids out. Now, there's a number of ways that this is happening. This is actually, I'm writing a new book that deals with this. Part of it is the change in how what we allow children to do outdoors. We're no longer allowing children to just go out and play outdoors. Everybody's afraid that there are these terrible dangers out there.
Mhm.
We even have a child protective system that will accuse parents of neglect if they allow their child to do something that was perfectly normal a few
Yeah.
decades ago, like walk to school by themselves, or take public transportation by themselves, or go play in the park without an adult there with them. So we are basically imprisoning children. I don't think that's too strong a word. They're either imprisoned in school where they're directed what to do, or at home it's like home confinement. They can't really go out without an adult accompanying them.
Mhm.
It's like you've got to have your guard with you. And I'm not really exaggerating. This sounds horrid, but this is the case. And so children are having much less opportunity to play, to explore. And the other thing that's happened is that school has become even more restrictive than it was in the past. Over the course of the second half of the 20th century, the average school year increased by 5 weeks in the United States. So children have less time off in the summer, and there's 1 week less of vacation in the winter than they had before. But that's not the worst part of it. We've more or less taken away recess. It's very short. Lunch hour, which used to at some time was an hour,
Yeah.
now is in most schools 20 minutes. Barely enough time if you go to the washroom and wash your hands and stand in line to get your lunch. There are reports that kids don't even have time to eat lunch. All of this because people are so concerned about scores on standardized tests,
Mhm.
which are testing really a very narrow range of knowledge that isn't even that important a range of knowledge for real life. But schools have become obsessed with these test scores, and we even have federally mandated programs that schools have to show increases in these test scores, otherwise they are judged as failing schools. This has occurred quite recently. It's really only in about the last 15 years or 14 years. Common Core, it's called, which has been adopted by most states, greatly restricts teachers in what they can do in the school, in the classroom. They have to be teaching to that test more or less all the time. They have to be following. This is a big change in school where teachers are no longer free to do what makes sense to them, what they can see that kids would learn more from. They're not free to have real kind of intellectual discussions or do creative things with the kids. They've got to be teaching the curriculum.
Yeah.
I happen to have a sister who was a very happy middle school teacher until 2010 or 2011, I guess it was, when Common Core took effect in the school she was at. Suddenly, she no longer, there was an administrator who would come into her class and see that she wasn't following the curriculum. She was having some other kind of discussion with the kids. And she became depressed because she realized that she was harming the children now doing this. She took a leave of absence for depression, and after that, she said, "There's no way I can go back to that." Now, I refer to her because, of course, I know her case personally, but many of the best teachers are resigning because they are no longer being respected themselves. They have to be teaching this mandated curricula by the state. The state has kind of taken over control. We used to, in the United States, kind of pride ourselves in sort of individuality and local control and so on and so forth. But the schools are increasingly under centralized control, which has really reduced the opportunity for those people, that primarily teachers who are in direct contact with the kids, to exercise their judgment about what would help. They can see whether the kids are happy or suffering or burned out, that, and they are no longer being allowed anything like the degree of freedom they used to have to respond to that. So that's changed. And the other thing that's changed that I think is very relevant for your concerns is that we're starting to teach so-called academics. I hate that word. I think it should be outlawed when you're talking about little kids. But so-called academics to little kids. It started some time ago with kindergarten, when kindergarten used to be a place to play. And then we started turning kindergarten into what formerly was first grade, which was starting to teach them some pre-reading skills, and now they're expected to know how to read by the end of kindergarten. I mean, and now this is even happening in preschool. Some states have almost compulsory preschool. It's not necessarily compulsory, but you feel like you're made to feel like you're a bad parent if you don't send your child there. Now now even preschool is not play. Preschool they're teaching this kind of stuff, and kindergarten is becoming, the new first grade. And so and one thing we know, but at least in the United States, the education authorities completely ignore it. Every single study that has ever been done, unless there's one that I have not found, that looks at the long-term effects of early academic training has shown it to be harmful. Not only does it not help, but it hurts. There have been many studies over the years, but the best study, the most well-controlled study, and also the most recent study is the Tennessee preschool study, which I'll explain briefly because I think everybody ought to understand what happened in this study. This was a program sponsored by the state of Tennessee, publicly funded program for children from relatively impoverished families. You had to be below the poverty line in order for your 4-year-old, this was for a program for 4-year-olds, to be admitted into this program. Now, it turned out that there were more families who wanted their 4-year-old in the program and who qualified in terms of poverty than the program could take in the first years. So this was a perfect possibility for an experiment. So researchers at Villanova University took control of an experiment. They randomly, purely randomly chose which ones of the 4-year-olds where the family wanted to be in the program would be in the program and which ones were not. Now, this wasn't even comparing two programs. This wasn't comparing a play-based program with an academic program. This was comparing an academic program with just being at home. Because the kids who were not in the program, for the most part, were at home. A few of them were in other kinds of programs like Head Start, but the great majority were just at home, which in an impoverished family, most people believe that's not an ideal situation, right? So the researchers followed the kids up all the way through 6th grade. And what they found is already by 3rd grade, those who were in the program were behind the other kids on every single measure. They were behind academically on academic tests. They showed more behavioral misbehavior. They showed less social ability. They followed them through 6th grade, and by 6th grade, these differences were even worse. The rate of diagnosed learning disorders, I don't know if this occurs in the Netherlands to the degree that it does here, but we are increasingly diagnosing kids as dyslexic or some other learning disorder. If they don't learn the curriculum, it can't be the fault of the schools. It must be the fault of the brain of the child. So we diagnose them as having some kind of a brain disorder, even though that diagnosis is never made by looking at the brain. It's just made by looking at the fact, well, we've put them through all this learning program and they haven't learned it, so there must be something wrong with the kids. So at any rate, the result was that the rate of diagnosed learning disorders was more than 50% higher in the kids who were in that early program than in the kids that weren't. There's no question but what. This program, which was approved, it's a well-funded program. The teachers had to have at least college degrees, if not master's degrees. They were well paid. They were paid at the same rate as teachers higher up. The program had been approved by people who were looking at what is the great standard of excellence for preschool academic training. And here it had clearly harmful effects. Now, interestingly, I first heard about this program when a state legislator from Tennessee called me. He told me what was going on, and he told me that the preliminary results, it looks like this program is having harm. And the legislature wants to suppress that because they want the program to keep going. They almost don't believe it. Fortunately, the program was being evaluated by these professors from Villanova who are not under the state control, and they published a series of articles about it, and it's now become well known. You would think that this then would lead people to look at all the many other previous studies that have been done. It's not just this study. Every study that's been done that looks long-term has found the same thing. But we just ignore it, and we continue on with more and more early academic training when, so people only look short term. So, this should be obvious. If you teach a certain set of skills to somebody, to some group of kids, and you don't to another group of kids, and then immediately afterwards, or maybe even a year afterwards, you test them on those skills, those that you've taught those skills to, they're going to score higher on the test, right? I mean, of course they are. But that doesn't mean that they've learned it in any kind of meaningful way. So it gets lost, or it even becomes something they've learned it in a kind of shallow way that may even be inhibiting their ability to learn it in a more serious way. So they've learned to mouth words, they've learned to read words, but that doesn't mean they've really learned to read and understand. It certainly doesn't mean that they've learned to enjoy reading and to read on their own. In fact, probably they've learned to hate reading. And I think that there's two things that are happening. One is when we teach little children these things, they're learning it in a shallow way. which interferes with really learning it. And the other, probably more important problem is we're burning kids out even before they start real school.
Uh,
We're giving them a negative attitude about this whole thing, and that attitude only builds over time.
mm. And you're not, you are sad, but you are still hopeful as well.
Well, you can't give up
No,
hope.
okay, yeah.
That's right. I think that what I'm hopeful about, what gives me some hope in the United States, I'm not sure that our school system is going to reform. But what gives me hope is more and more people are taking their kids out of the school system. More and more homeschooling. And as there are more and more homeschoolers, there are more and more people setting up alternative sorts of schools. And the United States is pretty good in allowing this to occur. That's one thing I have to say. At some point, the schools are already worried because they're losing so many kids. And within, you would think that the losing kids would be fine. That just means they have to spend less money, but they don't see it that way. When they lose kids, they get less federal money
Yeah.
to the school. And so they're worried about losing kids. And if they ever get the idea that we're losing kids because of what we're doing, and we better start appealing to the kids and to the families more,
Yeah.
that would be helpful. Sadly, however, the pressure that comes from parents is in the most part the opposite
Yeah.
of what I would hope it would be. They want more rigorous training because they believe falsely that you're going to become homeless if you don't go to college,
Yeah.
and maybe even if you don't go to a prestigious college. In this country, there's a big distinction between going to, say, an Ivy League college. At least people think there's a big distinction,
Yeah.
and just a regular state college. So people are motivated to push their kids to get those high scores that they think are essential to get into a fancy college. And they start pushing even at the
School.
preschool level.
Yeah.
I hear from teachers all the time, even teachers at the preschool level who are more free to do more things, that I'm getting pressured from parents to be teaching an
Yeah.
academic curriculum.
We recognize it all in the Netherlands, at least. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You were, if I may, Bas, yeah, because I have actually two questions. Because you say children who play less are more have a bigger chance of getting depressions, suicidal.
Right.
What's the mechanism behind it? Why is it? Why is this relationship there?
So I have two answers to that. The first one is so obvious that I'm even embarrassed to say it. Play makes children happy, right?
Yeah,
Play
it
makes
does.
children
Yeah.
happy. Is there anybody who doesn't understand that play makes children happy? And does there anybody that doesn't understand that if you take play away from children, they will not be happy? This
Yeah.
this isn't brain science. This is so obvious. How do we miss it? There was a famous play researcher, Brian Sutton Smith, who died a few years ago, and he used to say in his talks, the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. And so I don't say it that way because the grammar doesn't work for me. But clearly, what is life without play for any of us, but especially for children? What is life without play?
Yeah.
So, why live? I mean, so it's almost not surprising the suicide rate has gone up. But that's not the only thing. The other thing that play does is sort of Mother Nature has designed children to play in ways that lead them to develop psychological resilience, lead them to develop courage, lead them to develop what psychologists call an internal locus of control, meaning this sense I can do things, I can solve problems. If something happens to me, I can take care of it. when you have that internal locus of control, the world is less scary. Things can happen and it doesn't frighten you as much as if you have been raised in a way that you've never had the opportunity to be on your own and solve your own problems. You've always had adults around solving your problems for you. You haven't learned that you can solve your problems. We're raising children increasingly as if they're very fragile and they need to be protected all the time. That's why we're not sending them out to play. And if you raise them as if they're fragile, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're not acquiring because they're not experiencing the kinds of adventures, the kinds of mishaps, if you will, that are required to develop the sort of character traits that can deal with these things. People fall apart. We're experiencing now, even at the higher education level, in colleges and universities, students having psychological breakdowns about things that in the past they would have solved themselves. Somebody calls them a bad name, and that's traumatic to them. Well, if you've been out playing with kids, you've been called bad names lots of times, and you learn to shrug it off or to taunt them back, or you learn ways to deal with it. You've been bullied to a certain degree, and you figure out how to deal with bullies. Not everybody's nice in the kid world, and not everybody's nice in the adult world. You learn how to deal with people who aren't nice, when you're not being protected all the time from that. So that's the other part of it in the
That's the
long
mechanism.
range. So kids in the play in the short range makes kids happy, and happy kids learn better than unhappy kids. And also it leads them into the kinds of experiences that allow them to develop courage and resilience. One thing that kids are biologically inclined to do, in fact, all young mammals are that have been studied, is to play deliberately in risky ways, like to climb trees higher than their mom might want them to climb, dive off of cliffs, depending on where they live, do all these things that are a little bit dangerous. Why do they do that? And from an evolutionary perspective, there's a very clear answer to that. They're doing it because that's how they're learning how to deal with fear. They're putting themselves deliberately into a situation that generates a certain amount of fear in them, but it's a situation that they know they can handle. And their judgment is usually pretty good. Mother Nature also endowed them with a pretty good sense of what they can do and not do. Children are much more cautious than we think they are. You watching that child might not know that the child can climb the tree that high and keep control, but the child knows they can do it. And they're not going to go any higher than they know that they're capable of controlling. They're going up to the point where they're beginning to feel fear, but not terror. And they don't go any higher than that. They might next time go a little bit higher because now they feel a little bit more confident about that. So children, when they're playing in risky ways, are learning courage. And we are, by preventing children from playing in those ways, because we're always watching them and telling them, oh, no, don't do that. That's dangerous. We are preventing them from developing courage.
Could you say we don't trust the children anymore?
We don't trust children anymore. And sadly, in the United States, we also don't trust parents and we don't trust teachers. So that's why we are increasingly. So in fact, in the United States, if you as a parent send your child out, and many parents really understand that their children are capable of playing on their own, and it was actually good for their children to do it, but still they're afraid to send their kid out because there is a decent chance, believe it or not, even if this is, say, an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, that in the past you would have been a 5-year-old, you could go anywhere. And when I was 5, I could go anywhere. But now, even if it's an 8 or 9-year-old who's out there without an adult guard, there's a fairly decent chance that some neighbor, somebody, out of what they see as good intentions, will call the police and say there is a child out there in danger, no adult with them. And then the police bring the child home. So you've got this sort of traumatic thing of a policeman going into the house, talking to the parents, And then, at least in some states, there's a requirement that child protective services come and make a visit to the home and to see if these are negligent parents, and maybe that parents
Right.
need to be arrested or even have their child taken away.
Uh,
And there are cases of if you're white and middle class or above, you'll fight it in court and win. But if you're black and poor and can't afford a lawyer, there's a very decent chance that your child will actually be taken away from you for doing
this is
what was
horrible.
perfectly normal parenting in the
Yeah.
past. So
This,
this is the situation that we're
yeah.
in right now.
It's
This
really
is horrible.
worrying.
It's horrible, and I believe a friend of mine has had this in the States, so I know
Yeah,
it's happening.
you
It's
know it's
horrible.
happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most of our viewers and listeners of this podcast are working with very young children, aged between 0 and 4 years old. What would be your advice to these people in their daily work with these children?
Well, I think, the main thing, of course, is to give them plenty of opportunity and ways of playing. The more the more the children are mixed in age, the better. And this is especially true for young children. Older little children, under about 2 years old, even sometimes up to 3 years old, don't really know how, when they're just with other kids of the same age, don't really know how to play socially. The researchers call it parallel play. They're just doing
Yeah.
things, but they're not really socially interacting with one another. They may be kind of paying attention to what they're doing and influencing what they're doing. But if you put a 4-year-old in the mix, the 4-year-old playing with the younger children scaffolds the younger children into more interesting and higher levels of play. Age mixing, I believe, at all stages in the educational world is a great advantage. Children learn from older children. They pay attention to what older children are doing.
Hmm.
They want to do what older children are doing. When they're playing together, it's not that the older children drop down to a lower level of play. They change their way of playing so as to accommodate the younger child, but they're still playing in ways that are challenging for the older child and for the younger child, and they're bringing the younger child up to a higher level of playing. I've studied schools where children are never segregated by age, all the way from 4 years old up through teenage years. And those schools work primarily because the younger children are always learning from the older children. You don't need many teachers in such a school because the kids are learning to read by interacting with older children who know how to read. They're learning numbers by interacting with older children. And they're learning it just in their play. There's more and more games that require reading. There are games that require numbers. Cooking in the kitchen requires numbers, and that when they're doing things this way, and some of them know how to do this stuff and some don't, the younger children are learning it from the older children, and this is true at every age. I've been just reading some reports of home care situations where the people doing the home care for other families say it's a great advantage if, at least during non-school times, if families are including their 8 and 9-year-olds or 7, 8, 9-year-olds in my home care, because they love the little kids and the little
Yeah.
kids love them. And it eases my job because the older kids love to help take care of the little kids. They're
Yeah.
learning by doing it. You don't have to ask them to do it. They want to do it. And so it makes it more like a real family environment. The older
Yeah.
kids are a little bit like older siblings. So in my mind, the more you can mix the ages in this kind of a setting, the easier it's going to be for the people managing it.
Yeah.
And also, the more educationally productive it's going to be because age mixed play is always more educationally beneficial than when kids who are all at the same level are playing together.
That's interesting. There's a big debate of already 20 years, I think, in the Netherlands about whether we should have the babies and the kids until 4 mixed in one group or separated by age. And
Yeah,
I
no,
think most say that separation is the best.
yeah, I think
Unfortunately.
I think too many parents think that if your 4-year-old is with younger kids, that's going to hold them back,
No,
but it doesn't.
no, no.
And in fact, it stimulates them forward because they're learning some really valuable skills, like how to be a leader, how
Yeah.
to be a teacher. They're explaining things to the other kids, how to be a nurturer, and they're not reducing the level of what they're doing.
No, no.
They're bringing more creativity into it because you have to find creative ways to involve the younger kids, and you want to do that because you like the younger kids and you want to
Yeah.
involve the younger kids.
Interesting.
Also, Emmeline, go ahead.
Well, here, I think you will recognize this. Politicians in the Netherlands, they want to lower the age of schooling. So
Yes.
children used to be 7 when they went to school. It went 6, 5. Now they're talking
Right.
about 4 or even 3. What should we tell them? Tomorrow I'm talking with someone like that. So
Yeah,
what do I tell him?
Well, you can tell them some of the things that I've already said,
Yeah.
that, we're doing this and it's harmful. There's no
Yeah.
question. Research
Yeah.
has shown clearly, well-designed research studies have shown that this early training is harmful. Another thing I might suggest is, so Finland is in some ways a country not too unlike the Netherlands. A fairly egalitarian country, fairly homogeneous in a certain way.
Further, yeah.
You don't have the high rates of poverty, I don't believe, that you have in the United States. Now Finland scores very high on all these tests.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
they start teaching reading at age 7. They haven't changed this. I would think that you would get them to look at Finland. I haven't gone to Finland myself, but I keep reading about Finland, and Finland reminds me of the United States in the 1950s in some ways. Kids are still going out on their own. They're using
Yeah.
public transportation. They're not going to preschool where they're being taught, But I think in a way, that what is essential is that there are supports that are needed, and I don't know to what degree these occur in Finland. I don't know what degree that they occur in the Netherlands, but we've had for really many decades a program called Head Start in the United States, which is a preschool program.
Mhm.
When Head Start started way back in about 1960 or so, it was a very successful program. It did increase academic scores for kids who were in that program. It increased even the number who went on to higher education. It increased follow-up studies showed it did very well. But Head Start at that time was not thought of primarily as an academic training program. It was thought of as an anti-poverty program. This was during the Lyndon Johnson administration, and he had this anti-poverty program going. He's the last president we've had who tried to wipe out poverty, and this was part of that. And so you had to be below a certain economic category to be in the program. But what the program did is it provided employment for the moms who could work in the program. It provided home support where people would go to the homes and help the parents or moms, as often it would be single moms, help the parents learn about whatever social help programs they are. And the evidence is that the program helped primarily more by helping the moms than by teaching the children. So the moms now had a little bit of money. The moms had some kind of social support, and being in a family where the mom is a little bit stronger and you've got a little bit more money, that's what made the difference, not being trained in academic. Now, as time went on and we became obsessed with test scores, we still have Head Start, but now it involves academic training, and I've looked at the long-term studies, and it is no longer helpful. So I think that now I think if you want to increase, I think the secret to increasing, to especially reducing the amount of really bad performance in school that often comes from people who are from impoverished families, at least that's true in the United States, what you need to do is support the family. Um, every parent wants their child. I mean, almost every parent wants their child to do well. And we have to trust families, but we also then have to help families to be able to have the power to help their children. And that often requires academic help, but I'm sorry, not academic help, but financial help. And it requires helping them find jobs and helping them. One of the things the primary thing that Head Start did, one of the primary things is it was basically free babysitting, so the moms could go out and work. If you're a single mom and you've got a kid, you can't go out and work, so you're stuck in poverty.
Very interesting.
I think a lot of the trends you are describing in the US are very recognizable for us in the Netherlands, I must say. So will have to come to an end, unfortunately. We could talk for hours, Professor Gray. It's just very interesting. Maybe on behalf of my son, my final question, because in your book you wrote something about using tablets and iPads and screens, which a lot of parents and also schools are very worried about. But you're not as tough on that subject as some people are, aren't you?
That's exactly right. And in fact, I'm writing a new book that deals with this. There's a strong drive in the United States, and I think elsewhere too, to attribute the rise in anxiety, depression, suicide to the smartphone, to the mobile phone, and especially to social media. And Jonathan Haidt, who I know, who in some sense
He
I
just had
regard
his book.
as a friend, but he may not be thinking of me as that right now, wrote this book called The Anxious Generation, and it has played into everybody's prejudice that it is this that's causing the problem. He does talk about children's need for play, and he claims that this is an equal part of the book, but that's not what people are paying attention to. People are paying attention to the other part of it. I think what's happened is everybody wants to blame something other than what we adults are doing directly to our kids. Nobody wants to blame school. Almost nobody wants to blame school. Almost nobody wants to blame the fact we're not letting kids out to play. They want to blame these evil technology companies and their algorithms that are dictating our children. And so people who've never looked at the evidence believe this. Now, I happen to know that Jonathan Haidt believed this before he ever looked at the evidence. And then he hired somebody, a graduate student, to find the evidence to support what he already believed. And so, what are you going to do? You're a graduate, you're going to find the evidence. I have gone through the book and looked at the evidence, read the articles, and written kind of a rebuttal of it on my Substack. And the evidence really falls apart when you actually look at it. And it's very interesting that almost the only people who are not praising the book, who are writing negative reviews of it, are the real experts in this realm. who really do know the research. So, for example, Candace Ogden, who's a researcher in the United States who arguably is the most sophisticated person on this question. She's done lots of research looking at the relationship between smartphone use, social media use, and anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote a review for the journal Nature, a very respected scientific journal, uh, a negative review of The Anxious Generation, in which the first two sentences of her review were something like this. Jonathan Haidt has presented a very scary story that most parents are primed to believe, but it is not a story supported by science. And then she goes on. And that's exactly what I think. And I have looked at the science. I've in some of my Substack letters, I have presented presented the evidence, all kinds of evidence. I'm not saying that there aren't any problems with smartphones. There are problems with adults with them, there are problems with kids, but there are
Mm-hmm.
also a lot of benefits. And I think that it's very important that we think about the benefits and the harm. But the evidence actually is overwhelming that this sharp rise that we've seen in the United States, that most of the rest of the world, by the way, has not seen, the sharp recent rise in anxiety, depression, and suicide rates, is not the result of smartphones. Among other things, actually, if you throughout Europe, the EU has not shown, we've shown a huge increase in suicide rates since 2010. The EU has not shown that among teens. It just hasn't shown it. In fact, there's been a slight decline in suicide rates. If you look at anxiety and depression, depending on the measure, you can make it look like there's an increase or like there's a decrease or like there's no change. But this is something, this recent sharp rise is something that occurred in the United States. It's questionable whether it has occurred elsewhere. And I attribute it to Common Core. I attribute it to this change in schooling where school has become even more oppressive and anxiety provoking than it was before for the reasons that I gave earlier when we talked.
Mm-hmm.
The best evidence to me, there's all kinds of evidence for it, but best evidence to me, I believe that if you want to know what's bothering somebody, you should ask them what's bothering them.
Yeah.
So to me, the most interesting evidence comes from surveys of kids themselves. So when teenagers are surveyed about what's stressing them out, overwhelmingly, they say it's school. Overwhelmingly. So, for example, the American Psychological Association conducted a survey. They conduct a survey every year called Stress in America, and usually it's just of adults. But in 2013, they included teenagers, high school age teenagers in the survey. High school age teenagers came out as the most stressed out people in America, more stressed out than adults. When they did some of the survey, this wasn't deliberately, but just by timing, they did some of the survey during the school year and some of it during the summer when kids were off. They found the rate of reported stress was half as much in the summer when they weren't in school as when they were in school. And the other thing they found, because what they did is for everybody who reported that they have experienced severe stress over the last 2 weeks, which is the way they asked the question, they asked, what is the source of your stress? 83% said school. Nothing else came close. Nothing else came close. The second most commonly reported thing was worry about getting into a good college or getting a good job in the future, which still is kind of related to their worry
Yeah.
about their academic success, because they've been led to believe if they don't do well in school, they're not going to succeed as adults. Now, the same study was done, the previous time that they included teenagers was 2009. Now, that was before Common Core. So we've got a 4-year difference, but it straddles the time of Common Core. When they did the study in 2009, again, teenagers were highly stressed, but not quite as highly stressed. And when they asked, what is the source of your stress? It wasn't 83%, it was 50% who said it was school. So I think that beginning with Common Core, school became far more stressful than it was before. There are surveys of teachers that say this is true. There's surveys of school psychologists who say this is true. And so it's not just kids who say it's true, but to me, the most reliable report comes from the kids. I mean, if the kids were saying, no, school is just fine, even if the teachers said it's more stressful, I think, well, somehow it's more stressful for teachers. But but you know, who listens to kids, right? So that's the problem.
Maybe that's a nice way to end this podcast, that we should listen to the kids.
That's
Gray.
right. We need to listen to the kids. We need to start listening to the kids. And the kids recognize there are problems with social media. When you ask, there are surveys of kids and they'll say, oh yeah, you know, sometimes it draws me in and I spend too much time on it. And sometimes, you know, but when they're asked about bullying online, most kids say, I'm not that worried about bullying. I can just turn it off. I'm worried about the bullying that occurs in school. You know? Because there I can't escape it.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for making time for us from the US. There you see something nice from the new technology, that we're able to talk to each other in this way.
Exactly.
It was very interesting, and people who want to know more, of course, they can read your book, Free to Learn. You've got your TED Talk, you've got your own website and your Substack, so we can highly recommend that to all our listeners and viewers.
And we will. It was very interesting. We could go on for an hour, I guess.
Yes,
thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.